Okay, first of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Hey.
All right,
Yes.
very good, very good. Okay, well, I am going to ask everyone to go ahead and mute their microphone so we don't have any feedback. And then I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that okay? All right, very good. Okay, well, today we are going to learn about tomatoes, and I am excited that you guys are interested to learn about tomatoes as well. Tomatoes is, I don't know if it's technically, but it is probably our most popular vegetable crop. So I wanted to dedicate an entire class to just talking about tomatoes. So we'll go through our presentation, and at the end, I'll certainly leave time for any questions that you guys might have, things that I might not have covered in the presentation. So you'll certainly be given a chance to ask any questions that you have as well. Okay, so a little bit about my background with tomatoes. I have been involved with tomato research for close to 10 years. Before I worked for Extension, I worked for the University of Missouri Research Farm in Mount Vernon. And one of the horticulture research crops that we were involved with was tomatoes. We had a high tunnel tomato project that we did for several years that has continued through the years. And we did cultivar evaluations, and we did yield data, we did taste testing, just anything to do with tomatoes. Now that I work with University of Missouri Extension, I work a lot with not only homeowners and master gardeners with tomato growing issues, but I work with commercial tomato producers in this area, people that have farms that grow tomatoes, that sell them to farmers markets or restaurants, things like that. So anyway, another thing that I wanted to share with you is that this summer.
Hi, Kelly.
Hello.
Hi, Kelly. Sorry to interrupt. Can you set your PowerPoint to presentation mode to have them on full screen?
Yes. Let me see here.
Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
Okay. That's okay.
Are you kidding me?
How is that? Is that better?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. Okay, so a new research project that we are working on for this summer is grafted tomatoes. And grafted tomatoes are basically using the root system of an improved type of tomato, ones that may have disease resistance to some of our soil-borne diseases, have great benefits to make the plant more vigorous, produce more yield. And then the scion, or the top part of the tomato plant, is ones that could be heirloom variety of tomatoes. So let's go ahead, and if everybody could mute their microphones, that would be great. I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. So anyway, stay tuned for more information on this type of research. It is a really promising technology that has been used for several years now, and we're wanting to promote use with farmers in the area as well as homeowners in the area to try some of these grafted tomatoes to improve yields and overcome some diseases that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Okay, well, I wanted to start off by mentioning that tomatoes are in the Solanaceae family, sometimes called the nightshade family. And some other things that are in the nightshade family are, as far as vegetables go, peppers, eggplants, and potatoes. As far as other types of plants, Chinese lanterns, which is what we see right up here at the top. And this is sometimes an ornamental vining plant that people grow. Ground cherries, which is a type of weed. And sometimes they're grown for ornamental purposes as well. Petunias are in this family. Tobacco is in this family. And then angel trumpet, which we see down here on the bottom, is all in this family. Now, I mentioned these other types of plants because they are related to tomatoes. And because they are related to tomatoes, they can also share the same types of diseases and insect issues as well. So that's important to know. If you have these plants at your home and they have disease issues, those could spread to your tomato plants as well. Okay, so when you purchase tomato plants or even seeds, you may notice that the tag or the seed packet has these letters on there. And the letters on these tags or seed packets indicate that these particular plants have some disease or pest resistance. And this is what they stand for here. And I won't read through all of these, but I will send everyone a copy of this presentation so that you can have it for your notes if you want to refer back to it later. But that is what these letters these little short, the EB stands for early blight, that sort of thing. That's what these mean if you do see these on your plants. Okay, now another thing that I wanted to mention about tomatoes, and this is actually that we're seeing a lot of this right now. Places that sell tomato plants, their plants are starting to get very tall and leggy. Yesterday, I was at Wickman's Gardens and they were sharing some overgrown tomato plants with our master gardeners, ones that were actually about 3 feet in height, but were still in their little pots that they had been seed started in. And I just want to let you know that if you do see these plants, to not be scared of purchasing them. They're still great plants, and I'll give you a little trick on how to plant them. And some of you may already know this, but tomatoes can be planted really deep. So if you have a really tall, leggy tomato plant, a little seedling that you've purchased, and it is, 2 or 3 feet in height, go ahead and remove all of the lower leaves off of that plant, dig a deep hole, and plant that leave a few leaves on the very top, but plant that plant up to those top leaves. And any part of that stem that is buried in the soil will start to produce roots. Now, tomatoes are a unique plant. Not all plants will do this, but tomatoes will. If they're buried deep, they will produce what we call adventitious roots all along that stem. This not only gives that tomato plant more stability in the soil, but it also gives it an increased root surface area. So it's able to take up more water. It's able to take up more minerals and nutrients in the soil. So keep that in mind if you're purchasing plants that are overgrown. Now, another thing that I would do while planting these plants is they're likely going to be pretty root bound in those little pots. And you can kind of see that here in the pictures. So gently kind of loosen up that root system before you plant it in the ground. Don't just leave it in a little square. Loosen it up so that those roots will be able to spread out and penetrate the surrounding soil. Now, something else you can do with leggy tomatoes is you can plant them in a trench. If you don't want to dig a deep hole, you can make a little trench and you can plant them on their side. So you want to leave some of the top leaves above ground so that the plant can photosynthesize and start to grow, and it will start to grow upward. But you can bury the stem of that plant in the soil. It'll produce roots, and again, you'll have a healthier plant. So one thing to keep in mind with tomatoes, especially if you're new to growing tomatoes, you've never done it before, tomato plants can get very large very quickly. They grow very quickly, and they're going to need a lot of space. They're going to need more space than we realize. And even myself, I've been doing tomato research for years. I've been growing backyard tomatoes for years, and I still underestimate the size that my tomato plants will get. I think I have plenty of space. I think I've got a great trellising system, from the start, but my plants always, get away from me. They're just large, vigorous plants that grow very quickly. So make sure that you're giving them adequate space between plants. Tomatoes are very susceptible to fungal diseases, and fungal diseases love wet foliage. And now that we're in the hot part of the summer, we have a lot of dew that forms on the plants at night, and we want to allow that dew that's on the foliage to dry out quickly in the morning sun. So having your plants adequately spaced is going to help that foliage to dry out. So just be aware of that as well. 24 to 36 inches is a common spacing for tomatoes, but certainly give them more if you have the space. Okay, pruning and supporting. Now we're going to talk about pruning in just a moment, but tomatoes will need to be supported. Do keep in mind the type of tomato that you're growing. We have determinants, we have indeterminates. Determinate tomatoes are more of a bush type tomato. They will get to a certain height, usually 4 or so feet, and then they won't get any taller. They'll just get bushier, but they won't get any taller. If it's an indeterminate type of tomato, and these often are our heirloom tomatoes, they will just keep getting taller and taller and taller until first frost. And they will certainly need a lot of good staking. So do keep that in mind. Keeping your plants up off the ground produces larger, cleaner fruit. It makes it easier to harvest. It can help with disease issues. So do keep that in mind. Some disadvantages of supporting tomatoes, especially if you over prune, is that the fruit itself is exposed to sun. And whenever fruit is exposed to the sun, it's more likely to sun scald. And I've got a photo of that I'm going to show you in a moment. So when you are pruning your tomato plants, taking foliage, make sure that whatever fruit is remaining on the plant does have some covering of leaves so that it won't get sun scald. Okay, so a little bit about pruning. Pruning is often called suckering, and suckers are basically small lateral shoots that form in the leaf axis of small branches. And you can see here in this photo where this hand is that they are pinching off one of those suckers. And these are just little shoots that are not necessary for the growth or fruit production of the plant. And if we can go in and remove those, more of the plant's energy will go into producing bigger fruit as opposed to putting energy into producing more foliage, which the plant doesn't need. Now, ideally, you want to pinch these off when they're less than an inch long. Now, these suckers grow very quickly as well, and they can often get away from you, or you may not see them. And, you know, if they get larger or longer than about an inch or so, you might want to take some hand pruners and just prune those out. But if you can get out there early in the morning when there's a lot of water inside of the plant and the plant is really rigid and full of water, those will just snap off really easily. And the plant is better able to heal itself if you do just snap those off. Now, as far as how often to prune and sucker your plants, the general rule of thumb is about once a week. So go out once a week, walk through your tomato planting and look for any of those suckers. Now, even if you have taken off suckers, sometimes in that little leaf axis area, it'll start to produce a new sucker. So you may be resuckering the same area time and time again. And this isn't a fun job. You know, we would much rather be harvesting fruit or doing other things, but it's a necessary part of growing tomatoes, is getting rid of this excess foliage. So it's just something that has to be done. Okay, a little bit about tomato flowers and pollination. So as far as flowers go, they are typically in clusters of 4 to 8 flowers. Now, tomatoes are, for the most part, self-fertile, meaning that they can pollinate themselves. And the pollen is spread around by wind or just by the plant kind of blowing in the wind. That's enough to spread that pollen around and provide adequate pollination. Now, certainly insects are beneficial to the pollination of tomatoes. They can help to more efficiently spread some of that pollen around. So when you see bees and other types of pollinator insects on your tomatoes, that is a good thing. We want to have them help us out to get a better pollination on our plants. Now, one interesting thing about tomatoes is that when we get into really hot temperatures, above 90 degrees, that is going to affect the viability of that pollen. Above 90 degrees, that pollen is not going to be viable. The plant won't set fruit at that point. Now, tomatoes that are already on the plant will still be okay. They'll still grow, but new flowers, that pollen is not viable when temperatures are that hot. So do keep that in mind. And that is often why during the hot part of the summer, our tomato plants just kind of sit there. They don't do a whole lot. There's not a lot of growth. There's not a lot of tomato production. And that's why. It's because those high temperatures, that pollen is not viable. And then once we get into late summer or early fall and the temperature starts to go back down, we get that bumper crop of fall tomatoes. Now, this isn't the case with every cultivar of tomatoes. There are some cultivars of tomatoes that do better at high temperatures. And a lot of times our farmers that grow tomatoes in high tunnels, they use cultivars that are better able to tolerate high temperatures. But as far as our backyard tomatoes, if you've had an issue with summer fruit set in the past, it could be this very issue. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tomato problems, and certainly there are a lot of them. And some, you know, before I go into the tomato problems that we can have, sometimes it's weather related. You know, some years are just good years for tomatoes and some years aren't. You know, I hear it, you know, if we have a really hot, dry summer, or if we have a lot of rain, like we have a lot of rain like we're having right now. I know my tomato plants at home and the ones that we have here at the Botanical Center, they just haven't been growing a whole lot. The soil is waterlogged, and while tomatoes need adequate water, they don't quite need as much water as we have had. So tomatoes will just sit there until growing conditions get a little bit more optimal and hopefully put on some new growth at that time. So it's certainly weather dependent. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about blossom end rot. And this is a very common issue with tomatoes. And basically what it is it is a leathery brown rot of the blossom end of the fruit. So if you think about a tomato, there's the side that connects to the plant, that's the stem end. And then there's the side where the blossom or the flower started to produce the tomato. And that is the end that will get this blossom end rot. And sometimes we don't see it until we go out and start to harvest that tomato, and our finger goes up in this rotten part and we didn't even know it was there until it was too late because it's on the bottom side of the tomato and you can't see it. So what causes this? Well, it's caused by poor calcium distribution in the fruit. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not calcium in the soil. There very likely could be plenty of calcium in the soil, but there could be other factors that is preventing the plant from taking up that calcium. And some of those factors are, it could be the cultivar of the tomatoes. Some cultivars of tomatoes are just very prone to blossom end rot. It could be something to do with watering. It could be too much water, too little water. And sometimes that's hard to control, especially with all of the rain that we've had right now. Mulching can help with that. It can help to even out some of that water distribution in your planting a little bit. But good even watering can help prevent this. Now, another common issue with blossom end rot is soil pH. So if you've been plagued with blossom end rot for several years and you've tried fertilizer and it still isn't helping the problem, it could be the pH of your soil. If your pH is too high or too low, it can affect calcium uptake by the plant. So it might be a good idea to go ahead and do a soil test, see what your soil pH is, and then you can adjust accordingly. Okay, fruit cracking. This is another common problem that we see with tomatoes. And for the most part, it doesn't affect the fact that we can still eat these tomatoes. They don't look great. If we were selling tomatoes, this probably isn't something that we would want to see, but just for home use, you can still eat these. Now, these fruit cracks will eventually split open, exposing the inside of the fruit, and then fruit flies can come in and other problems like that. But before they, crack open, you can certainly harvest those and bring them inside. But this can be caused by sudden abundant moisture, especially if after that sudden abundant moisture, we go into a period of drought. So this is certainly caused by watering issues, but there are some cultivars they just do this naturally, especially this radial cracking that we see right here in the photo. There are some of our heirloom varieties that just do this, and there's really not much that can be done about it. Just make sure that you harvest those tomatoes before that crack gets too deep. Now, we talked about sun scald, not over pruning your plants, making sure that tomatoes that are still on the plant have some protection. But tomatoes are kind of like our skin. If we get too much exposure to sun, they sunburn just like we do. So that is what this picture shows here. It shows what sun scald on a tomato looks like. And then once this happens, it can cause other issues, secondary issues like mold to start to set in. So cat facing, I get a lot of questions about cat facing, and cat facing is what you see here. It's basically just deformed tomatoes that don't look right. They just don't form right. And this can be caused by a couple of different issues. It can certainly be caused by herbicide injury, but more often than not, it's caused by cool weather during fruit set. So if you think about that tomato flower and the pollen and the parts of that flower, if there is cool weather going on at the time of fruit set, the fruit doesn't form right from the very beginning. And then as that fruit starts to expand and get larger, those deformities show up in the form of cat facing. Cool weather, there's not much that we can do about that. But this problem usually kind of rights itself in tomatoes as we go through the growing season. But if you have had issues with this in the past, that is likely what it is. Yellow and green shoulder is another issue that we see in tomatoes. And this is a picture of what it looks like here. And basically the tomatoes just don't fully ripen. Part of it'll ripen, but then the very top around the stem end of the tomato just won't finish off ripening. Now, some cultivars just do this naturally and it is ripe. You can go ahead and pick it, but usually this is due to really high temperatures. Not only will high temperatures affect fruit set, but they can affect ripening on the tomatoes that are already on the plant. Zippering, and you may have seen this on your tomatoes, and basically this is what it looks like. It just looks like kind of a line, a zipper looking line that goes up and down the tomato. And just like cat facing, this is often caused when we have cool weather at the time of fruit set. And you can see here the parts of the flower kind of stick together and they don't separate like they should, and we can get this deformity. Okay, well, let's briefly go over some tomato diseases. There's a lot of them out there, so I just want to introduce you to these diseases so that you can be on the lookout for them as we go into this growing season. Okay, the first are wilt diseases. Typically, Fusarium and Verticillium wilts are the common ones that we see. Now, this is a soil-borne disease that can live in the soil for many years. Now, if you've attended any of my vegetable or disease classes in the past, I'm sure you've heard me talk about crop rotation. And if you haven't, I'll just mention crop rotation. Crop rotation is rotating your crops to a different spot, not planting the same thing in the same spot year after year after year, especially with tomatoes or other plants in the tomato family. Because if you do that, these diseases can build up in the soil, and again, they can live there for many years. So we want to prevent that. So this is a soil-borne disease. The plant takes it up through its root system, and there are some resistant varieties if you have had problems with this before. But keep in mind, even with a resistant variety of tomato, it doesn't mean that the plant is 100% resistant to these diseases. It means that it's not as likely to get them, or not likely to get them as bad. It's kind of like our flu shot. If you get a flu shot, you can still get the flu. It's just not as bad. And then your chances of getting it are less. Well, it's the same with these resistant varieties as well. And so what to look for is you'll start to see wilting and yellowing of the leaves, and then it'll spread through the entire plant pretty quickly, usually within 2 to 3 days. A healthy plant will go from looking healthy to all of a sudden just being completely wilted. Probably the most common tomato disease that we have is blight, specifically early blight, sometimes called alternaria. This is also a soil-borne disease, and it also survives in plant debris. So at the end of the growing season every year, make sure that you're going out to your tomato and vegetable plots and cleaning up all of those dead plants. And these diseases can also survive the composting process. So don't throw these diseased plants in your compost pile. Now, if you have a really active compost pile, you're monitoring the temperature, you're turning it on a regular basis, you can overcome it somewhat, but for the most part, don't compost these plants. It's just not worth the risk. Dispose of them, burn them, because the spores can live on this debris as well. The spores can also be wind dispersed. So if we have a really windy day or wind blown rain, they can blow around on your plants. And one of the best ways to tell that you have blight on your tomatoes is that the infection will start on the oldest leaves first, or the lowest leaves on the plant. That's where we see it first. You start to see those leaves turn yellow and then turn brown, and then you just see it spread up the plant. Classic symptoms and signs of early blight. What can you do to prevent early blight? Well, again, rotate your crop. Don't plant the same thing in the same spot year after year after year. Use a mulch around the base of your plants so that when we get heavy rain, soil is not splashing up on your plants. That is a very important thing to do as well. Now, there are some fungicides on the market that you can spray your plants with that are labeled for early blight. There are synthetic fungicides and there are organic fungicides. Whichever you prefer to use, fungicides have to be applied on a pretty regular basis throughout the growing season, starting at the time of planting through the time that we get our first frost. Usually every 2 weeks is what the recommendation is. That can vary a little bit with a particular product. So whatever product you use, read the label, follow those labels very carefully, and it'll likely have to be reapplied after we've had rain. Now, one good thing in early blight development is that there are some newer cultivars of tomatoes that are on the market that have some resistance to early blight. And I think these are called, oh goodness, it's a whole series of tomatoes and they're called Mountain Magic, I believe. And there's some variations on that name. So we are starting to see those on the market, which is a very good thing because again, this is one of our most common tomato diseases in this area. All right, come on, computer. There we go. Okay, so another thing that you can look for as far as early blight goes is you can look for concentric target-like rings on the leaves. And you can see, this isn't the best picture, but you can see that these little spots on the leaves kind of look like a bullseye and they have those little rings that come out from the center. And if we have mild rainy weather, which we've had a lot of, that's when we see these rings start to develop. So I often encourage people to go out and scout their gardens once a week. Just go out, walk through your plantings and be on the lookout for any spots on the leaves that may be the start of a disease. If you can catch this in the very early stage and get rid of these leaves, sometimes that can help it from spreading up the plant, but you have to stay on top of it, monitor your plants for spots like this. Okay, another disease that we see sometimes is septoria leaf blight. Now, this one is not quite as common, but I do get questions about it every year. And as far as disbursement and prevention and that sort of thing, it's just the same as early blight, but the spots on the leaves will look a little bit different. These particular spots will have a white center, and then the margins will be kind of a dark brown, tan, gray, and then there will be a yellow halo around the spots, as you see here in this picture. That is septoria leaf blight. Now, one that we don't see a lot, but I have had reports on, is late blight. Now, late blight, you can see what the picture here, you can see what it looks like on the leaves. It can decimate a crop of tomatoes pretty quickly. Now, the bad thing about late blight is that this is a disease, a fungal disease that can live in the soil for, I think the average is like 20 to 25 years. We had a commercial tomato producer that had a high tunnel that was infested with late blight a couple of years ago. And, you know, once you have a fixed structure like a high tunnel or a greenhouse with infected soil, there's just not a lot of things that can be done. Now, we did work with him to do some other things, but this is just another example of scouting your plants on a regular basis and being very mindful that you notice any kind of strange leaf deformities or patterns or spots like this. And if you ever have a question on something odd with your tomatoes, feel free to email me pictures, bring a sample in the office, bring a sample to our Master Gardener hotline, and we will try to identify it for you, hopefully earlier than later. Now, this particular grower that I was just telling you about that had a high tunnel with infested soil, this is one of the things that we had him do is you can grow tomatoes in these grow bags, and this is what they look like. And sometimes with our tomato producers, they won't have any soil in their high tunnels or greenhouses at all. It is actually a concrete floor, and that's so they can sanitize and clean that floor and not have any soil in there at all. They grow in these bags, and then that way, if they have a crop of infected tomatoes, they can just dispose of this soil, use new soil, and that's not going to affect them having to move a structure or something like that. Now, as far as these grow bags that you see here, these can also be used for lots of crops. They can be used by homeowners. I have spoken to several people lately that have really enjoyed growing in these grow bags. It kind of works the same as any container. You can put your own soil mix in. These grow bags can last for several seasons. They can be disinfected, and just a great option, not only for disease issues, but just for ease of planting as well. Okay, anthracnose is another disease that we see on tomatoes, and one of the classic signs of anthracnose is on your fruit, you will see black cup-shaped sunken areas. This is what it looks like here. Once these spots start to form on your fruit, decay will set in pretty quickly. Now, again, this is another disease with the same vectors and treatments that we've talked about with the other ones that we've mentioned, fungicide sprays, crop rotation, things like that. But I did want to introduce this one to you so you can be on the lookout for these sunken black areas on your fruit. Okay, another thing that I want to mention is viruses. Now, I've got a picture in the next slide that I want to show you of a virus issue that I've actually been helping someone to deal with just in the last few days. Now, this particular virus here is something called tobacco mosaic virus. And you can see from this picture the progression of this disease. Starts out looking healthy, and then all of a sudden it just starts to decline. Now, tobacco mosaic virus, remember we said that tobacco and tomatoes are related. Tobacco mosaic virus is I don't want to say a common virus of tobacco plants, but it occurs. And so if you smoke or use chewing tobacco and you don't wash your hands and you go out and work with your tomato plants, you can have some of that virus on your hands and infect your tomato plants without even knowing it. Now, this virus doesn't hurt us if you smoke or use tobacco. You know, this virus isn't going to get in your body and hurt you, but it will live on your hands if you don't wash them, and you can transmit it and not even know it. So we don't see a lot of this, but it can happen. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. Okay, so this is the viral issue that I have been dealing with the last couple of days. Now, this is actually on pepper plants, but tomatoes can get it as well. And this is called cucumber mosaic virus. And the way that these pepper plants got this disease was on a seedling table. So this particular farmer starts his tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and most of his vegetables from seed. He has a big table where all of his little seedling plants are, and he suspects that thrips, which are very small insects, got on his cucumber plants, which had this virus unknowingly to him, and then jumped over to his pepper plants and spread the virus. Now, although this is a pepper plant, you can see what this virus looks like on the leaves. Now, this can look the same on tomato plants as well. You can kind of see these angular, jagged lesions on the leaves. Now, this will eventually spread. It will get larger. It'll typically start out on the older growth of the plants, which is what was growing at the time that those thrips were jumping around on the seedling table, and then will eventually spread up to the newer growth on the plant. So long story short on that, again, just scout your plants, be aware of anything that looks unusual on the leaves, send me pictures, an email, and I can help you identify some of these diseases, because we certainly don't want to infest your soil or have it spreading to other plants. Now, as far as bacterial diseases, we do get a few bacterial diseases, usually in the form of something called bacterial spot or speck. And let me show you a picture of what that looks like. It looks like little spots or specks that show up on the leaves or on the fruit. And one thing that you may have noticed with these tomato diseases and issues is that sometimes they look alike, and sometimes it's really hard to tell. So again, just scout your plants, look for things like this. And if you are having a hard time identifying it, reach out to me and I can help if needed. Now, I will mention a little bit about walnut trees, and most of you have probably heard this before, but walnut trees produce a chemical in the soil called juglone. And juglone is a substance that prevents other things from growing around the tree. It's like its own herbicide that walnut trees produce to prevent things from competing with it for water and nutrients. Now, tomatoes are very sensitive to this juglone in the soil. So if you have walnut trees in your lawn and you have them in close proximity to your vegetable garden, do keep this in mind. The general rule of thumb is to plant tomatoes or don't plant tomatoes within 60 feet of that tree. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so something that we have been getting lots of reports on, even this year, I've had it just recently, and in the last several years, is herbicide injury. Tomatoes are very, very, very sensitive to even small amounts of herbicide. Herbicide is things like Roundup or other chemicals that are sprayed to keep weeds under control. Now, tomatoes can get herbicide injury a couple of different ways. It can blow in. If you're spraying your yard and there's even just a little bit of wind that day, it can blow over on your plants and cause what you see here. If you have a neighbor that's up to a mile away that's spraying on a windy day, it can blow in and affect your tomato plants. And boy, we see this happen time and time and time again. Another way that your tomatoes can be exposed to herbicide is through soil. If you bring in a load of soil or compost, it can have herbicide in there that you might not be able to see, or you can't see, you don't know. And this happens mainly when animal manure or bedding or infected hay or something like that has been used in compost mix, and that field has been sprayed with some kind of a herbicide, and a cow can go out there and graze this field and eat that hay and not be affected by that herbicide, but that herbicide can pass through their digestive tract, come out in their poop. The poop is used to make compost. It's still active in that compost, and then you use it on your tomatoes, and this is what happens. The tomato plant will start to just shrivel up, and the leaves will tightly curl, and that is a classic sign of what herbicide damage looks like. And boy, we see this all the time. I get probably at least 1 or 2 inquiries about this a week. Someone sends me pictures, what's going on with my tomatoes, and that's usually what it is. Now, some tomato cultivars, their leaves will curl a little bit if we have cool temperatures, but they won't curl this much. Herbicide injury, they're tightly curled, very, very tightly curled. Cool damage just causes a little bit of curling. So there is a difference there that can be seen with the naked eye. Now, another thing that I will caution you about is grass clippings, especially if you have applied weed and feed type products to your lawn, and then you mow your lawn and you have all these grass clippings and you decide to apply that as a mulch or organic matter to your garden, the herbicide can be in there as well. And the herbicide can also survive the composting process, like we talked about with the cow. That herbicide can live in that soil or compost for a long period of time. Now, if you buy a load of soil or compost and you suspect that it has herbicide in it, one really quick and easy way that you can test that is to get some green bean seeds. Green beans are also very susceptible to even small amounts of herbicide, and do what we call a green bean assay test. So you get a little flower pot, put some of the soil or compost in it, plant your green bean seeds in there. Those green bean seeds are going to germinate very quickly, just in a couple of days. And then as they start to grow, if they're shriveled and curled up, that tells you that you probably have some herbicide carryover in that soil or compost. Now, if you have a big pile of this infected soil or compost, what can you do? You've already bought it, you've drug it home. One thing that you can do is turn it on a regular basis. Get out there with a shovel or a pitchfork or a tractor and turn it and expose it to the air and expose it to the sunlight. As it's exposed to the air and sunlight, the herbicide that is in there is going to dissipate, and you'll have to do it several times. It can take several months to get all of that herbicide out of there, and you might have to repeatedly do these green bean tests to see But you know, not all is lost. It's going to take some time, but you'll eventually be able to use that soil again. So I wanted to spend some time on this because this is a very common issue that, again, we're seeing. I get a couple of inquiries a week on this, and just be aware if your tomatoes start to look like that. So I know that seemed like a lot of bad news about tomatoes, and I don't want to scare you from growing them, but I just want to make you aware of some common things that happen. You know, some people really struggle with tomatoes. They want to grow them so bad, and they try, and they just get plagued with these different issues. But you know, don't give up. Keep trying. Try new different types of tomatoes. There's so many cool colors and sizes and heirlooms and hybrids. So don't give up, keep trying, and do these things right here. This is the takeaway from today's class. Scout your tomatoes, look for insects, look for weird spots on the leaves. Rotate your crop. Make sure you're not planting the same thing in the same spot every year. Clean up at the end of the growing season. Get your plants out of the garden so they're not sitting there all winter, putting those soil or those spores back in the soil. Avoidance basically just means mulching the area so soil is not splashing up on the plants. Use a drip or soaker hose, basically just meaning water from the base, water right at the soil line rather than overhead. Overhead watering, again, causes those leaves to stay wet for a long period of time, which all of these diseases love. They love wet foliage. So water right at the soil line if possible. If you can't, if you have to do overhead watering, water first thing in the morning so the plant can dry out quickly in the sun. Experiment with some of these disease-resistant cultivars that I was talking about. If you do see insects, especially things like tomato hornworms that are large and pretty easy to see, hand pick those. There are some pesticides and other chemicals that can be used. There are organics, there are synthetics. That's what your extension office and Master Gardener hotline is here for, to help you identify these things and recommend a product that you can use. But just doing these things is going to set you up for success with your tomatoes. I just want to show you what a hydroponic tomato system looks like. This was a farm that I visited a few years ago. These plants grow up to 1 foot a day. They are growing in a water solution that has fertilizer going through it. And you can see how clean this greenhouse is. It is spotless in there. They don't want diseases setting up in this greenhouse. So they go through and they make sure that there's no, leaves on the ground or anything like that. They keep it absolutely spotless. So I wanted to show you that. And then, like I said, don't give up. This is the benefit, being able to can tomatoes, to make juice, salsa, pico de gallo, fresh tomatoes. Just, this is what we want right here. So don't give up. Summer is starting. And again, the extension office, the Master Gardener hotline, we're here to help you if you have problems, because we want you to have successful tomatoes. So with that, I will stop sharing and open it up for questions. So let me look in the chat here and see. Okay, well, I'm glad everybody liked the class. So what about questions? Yes, Alex. And you can unmute if you would like to and ask your question. Okay, in the first slide, you showed the tall tomato starts, okay. Is it too late if you have already planted those to replant them lower? I would say no. It is very likely that they have not put out too much of a root system yet. So you should be able to dig those up pretty easily and plant them a little bit deeper. So certainly go ahead and do that. Good question. Okay, a question on pruning. Besides suckers, do you prune the lower 6 inches to get leaves off the ground? That is a great point, Lori. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, as the plant starts to grow and you still have those lower leaves, yes, go ahead and prune those as well. You don't want any leaves near that soil line. So yes, and you probably seen this in that hydroponic picture I just showed, how as that plant grows, they prune off those lower leaves. So yes, that is absolutely a good practice to do, yes. All right, any other questions? You can put it in chat or unmute yourself. Okay. Okay, well, one thing that I will close us out with today, so I think earlier I mentioned the tomato starts that I got from Wickman's Gardens yesterday. They have an absolute ton of tomato plants right now, and some of their first tomato plants are 2 to 3 feet tall, and they're not able to sell them. They donated those to the master gardeners, and I have a whole bunch of those. If anyone needs tomato plants, send me an email, and you can just reply to the email I sent you this morning about the link to this class. And I don't have them here at the Botanical Center today, but I'll bring them tomorrow. If you want to come by and pick up a few of those plants, I would be happy to share those with you. Again, plant them deep, plant them in a trench, and they're great, healthy looking plants. And kind of, if you haven't planted anything yet, this kind of will help you to get a start on the growing season. So just email me if you're interested in any plants. So, okay, with that, that is our time for today. Tomorrow, I will send you a follow-up email with the recording link to this class. I will also send you a copy of the presentation if you want to keep that for the notes. And then again, email me if you have any questions going throughout the growing season with your tomatoes. And I'll go ahead and leave it at that. And happy growing, and thank you for joining us today.